Hello everyone and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 Dev Diary. Today, not talking about an upcoming expansion, but actually being more of a retrospective, as this is the 9-year anniversary of Hearts of Iron 4. Almost one more year till a decade, really. Oof. As such, we're going to be doing something of a retrospective by looking at what the goals have been over the past 3 years and deciding whether they've been a success or failure, while also looking towards the future. So, let's head in. Greetings all. As the oft-quoted Eisenhower stated, "In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." In the spirit of this, they thought it would be time to take a look at the long-term roadmap for HOI4, and, since it's been 3 years, see how they've done. Back in No Step Back, the main things they wanted to focus on were frontline stability, strategic and tactical AI, and battle planner improvements. For those who might have forgotten, that particular content battle plan looked like this, with a wonderful picture at the top, talking about their plans post-Podcat leaving, Dan Lind, and the shift for what they were looking to do. Improvements in frontline stability, national focuses improved, defensive warfare, and things like diplomacy, economic and immersive roleplay. Jumping back to the present, they continue by talking about Gotterdammerung being one focus that had AI force concentration at its key core, which I guess could be seen to improve the difficulty slightly, but is something they didn't want to improve upon too much, because if the game has a sudden jump in difficulty, then the meta, or the community meta as they put it, has to be shifted so that the players can catch up. In short, there's no reason for them to not continue iterating on AI features that may increase average difficulty or required skill level. But let's cover now the core of this dev diary, which is going through all the things they really wanted to do 3 years ago and seeing how much of a success they've been, starting with long-term goals and strategies to guide AI. They say that most of this is under the hood, but they've made a lot of progress, adding tooling to interpret and direct how the AI performs long-term planning. They say that this area of the game is notoriously opaque, and it's taken a fair while to get to the point where they have enough insight into the decision making of the AI. I guess from a player standpoint, it can be slightly more difficult to understand whether you think the AI is successfully achieving its long-term goals, I guess as juxtaposed between historical AI and non-historical AI. Generally speaking, I think it's been a mixed bag. I feel Gotterdammerung did pretty okay in terms of most of the focus trees, although Germany seems to struggle a little bit more now, while Graveyard of Empires has some bigger flaws in my opinion. I may be wrong about this, but it was to my memory that the original vision of the game had it so that Germany was always slated slightly more to win in a historical context. This was because Germany was going to be kind of the main character country for players, so it would be the easiest, but it also meant it was going to be more of a formidable challenge for Soviet players and the Allies to try and defeat them. Post Gotterdammerung though, I have to say, without any human interaction, I think the German AI is perfectly capable of defeating itself, kind of because of maybe 2 or 3 main factors. It struggles to deal with the economy, I feel. Its economy build-up feels a little bit weaker. Its unity with its allies in trying to form front lines properly seems to be a bit weaker. That can be across the board though, and especially its ability to deal with supply in Russia. Post the supply of No Step Back, German ability to push all the way to the Urals is just not there. So yeah, I'd say a mixed bag through and through. It's hard to say, but the Asia front lines do seem to be slightly more historical. Improving peace conferences. By Blood Alone saw a new contribution-based peace conference system added, with numerous narrative demand options. They say that this approach here was not super stable, and while the feature hit most of the keynotes, such as contesting demands and rewarding better play, it still fell into a similar trap to the old system when it came to AI antagonism. They feel though they're in a better, if not perfect, situation now. And in this one, I definitely have to agree. For those who may not remember, the old peace conference system would absolutely destroy you with some weird things where there would be like one state randomly in the middle of some land that the AI would take, they have no reason to take it, and they would just take it anyway. And after that was done, there was nothing you could do to stop them. This would completely remove your ability to complete some achievements without effectively doing a world conquest. So in terms of achievement hunting gameplay, the new peace conference system is a far better solution. As they say themselves, peace conferences though are not perfect, and I'm really thinking of ways to make them even better. I always felt that the best peace conference system I ever saw was in Europa Universalis 4, with the way you make demands and build up to that score, but the scale of the conflict in HOI4 is so much larger, I'm not sure how well it would translate. Something I do think though is if you're trying to annex certain pieces of territory and you're holding onto the territory, perhaps if you've held it for long enough, or there's a reason for you to hold it, you could get maybe a sort of temporary claim on some land until the conflict is over. That way, it's not so just about one country capitulating another, therefore they hold the land, therefore they can take it, but also the land you're trying to go for and pushing for it. But again, peace conferences are such a difficult way to perfect on such a large scale. I do not envy trying to find a perfect solution. Updating core national focus trees with alt history paths alongside more options is something they've been trying to do ever since we saw the return to Death or Dishonor focus trees, especially with, I think it was first Yugoslavia. Minor maintenance updates have been included in some war effort patches, which are, as they state, well, minor, but they've added a few fair things to various focus trees over time, and on the more DLC side, they have been revisiting focus trees such as Germany and Hungary. I think the mass consensus here is that the wider player base actually prefers this to the newer focus trees. When you look at the previous scores, people are less interested in South America and the Middle East, but they seemed far more interested in Europe and playing basically countries that previously had content but now have more content. If that was an indication of ways to take the game into the future, then I would probably say the things to focus on now are going to be Japan, China, America, and Britain, as I think they're the 4 countries that haven't seen any seriously significant love in quite some time. Not to mention the fact that Japan, America, and Britain are all huge naval powers, so I don't know, there is some collaboration within there. Great power diplomacy. They've spoken at length on this in a few other places, but fundamentally, design ideas for this always end up conflicting with focus trees, as HOI4 is a war simulation with a superimposed latch-driven state machine that drives the global narrative, and they're not planning to change that approach. I guess the thought process here is, unlike a game like Europa Universalis 4, where kind of the diplomacy of the world is generated through state-to-state interactions, the way that the narrative of your nation is driven is actually just going down the focus tree. So adding in things like the embargo feature are kind of not as serious additions as perhaps some people would like them to be. I may find myself in the minority here, because the way I would have always liked focus trees to kind of work more as is the decisions you take will influence what aspects of a focus tree you unlock, as opposed to picking a path and then going down that path. So one example that I always hold in such high esteem is Mexico, which is a focus tree where all sides of the focus tree are available to you, and you have very small drop-off points where, okay, I want this type of country with communist characteristics, or I want this type of country with Catholic democratic characteristics. Ultimately, you're not picking a path so much as you're playing down all the options that Mexico has and then customizing it based on the diplomacy you choose along the way. Multiplayer and social layer improvements and support, which comes primarily in the form of the Career Profile Edition to try and increase the ways that people enjoy playing HOI4 multiplayer, which they didn't have an issue with previously because multiplayers are such a large factor that drives the popularity of the game. However, the feature has proven to be unexpectedly popular among specific groups within the community as completionists, but also as a learning aid of things to do. They say that they don't have any desires to make any fundamental additions to this, but neither will it be going away. I personally am a fan of the career profile feature. I do think it's a little understated within the game's kind of framework to be something to really enjoy, and it doesn't offer enough in terms of goals for countries to pursue that makes you want to go through it. In my head, the ultimate kind of career profile page has always been World of Warcraft's achievements. There's a huge book of things to do in different kinds of facets, and I could totally imagine a world where HOI4, with all the different countries and all the different paths and all the different things you can try to do in it, could have some variation of that with a career profile filled with challenges to achieve that you can share with other people. But that's just an idea. Economic decision making. They haven't made any great strides here. Oof, I guess that's not the greatest, most positive statement. They still have medium to long-term plans to expand the industrial economy elements of HOI, while taking care to avoid simulating too many pure economic elements. Yeah, I have to say, personally, I do think the economy aspect of the game could be one of the most lacking. Personally, I understand, of course, that this is a World War II simulation game, but it's also worth remembering that the first 4 years of gameplay are basically an economy management simulation game, transitioning a civilian economy into a military one, and with that, having more avenues to understand and transition would probably increase the depth of the game. If I was to make one big request at this point, a hard concrete request, I think it would be a change to the way trade works. I'm not a fan of the idea that trade is handled entirely by the one asking for the resources, but the one offering them has no say. If I was to buy steel from, let's say, America for an amount of civs, it shouldn't be something I just turn off on a whim. It should be a deal that lasts a year, 2 years, whatever. That way, if you wanted to play a country with a large economic basin of resources, let's say Sweden for example, then instead of just arbitrarily having civilian factories appear or disappear depending on whether the AI chooses to trade with you or not, you could go out and try to make deals with the AI specifically to try and build up a civ count that will last for a very specified decent length of time. Then the focus tree is more so about giving you trade opinion factor to maximize the chances that people will choose you to trade with. Think of it kind of like the international market. You both have to ask people and then commit to a trade deal over a time period. Yeah, I think that's the big thing I'd like. Special projects. Gotterdammerung represents the culmination of this project. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, me not being me, but me being the devs. Though now that they've had some time to monitor the wider effects of special projects, it's about time to revisit balance and take a pass on the huge array of tech that was added with the update. Yes, I am a big fan of the special projects, maybe a little bit slow in some contexts. Even majors feel like they really struggle to get going on certain projects unless they prioritize them early. So, I don't know, I feel like there's a little bit of a bit too heavy thing on some special projects. For example, if you've got excess civilian factories, there could be an option inside of the special project screen where you can give maybe 1 to 5 civs to a research facility to boost its generation of points. Maybe then you can get through things slightly faster at the cost of a civilian industry. Alright, are you still with us? Because we're still going. More differences between sub-ideologies and government forms, advisors and internal political improvements is something they didn't really do, as it's a difficult topic to broach in a strategy game and other things took precedence. They've seen some minor changes but nothing to write home about. Of course, many people who play mods for the game will know there are a tremendous amount of sub-ideologies possible. If you've ever played Kaiserreich, for example, it can really shift on the minor differences from democracy turning into liberalism, conservatism, social democracy. It can be quite a wide spectrum. I'm not sure how much this would add to the traditional HOI4 gameplay in terms of vanilla, because they've kind of cemented the way it is currently, but it is worth thinking about. More national focus trees. Well, they added more with every DLC they did, so I guess they succeeded here. Make defensive warfare more fun is a goal they say they're still working on, but they haven't managed to tackle it yet because of the fundamentals of HOI4 kind of stop it from having its true justice being done, though it plays hand in hand with changes to doctrines and division design. Hard for me to say on this one personally, because I don't hate the way that defensive warfare works, although I could understand from a sort of gameplay perspective that a lot of it is about building up your defensive stats and then kind of being AFK, cycling out divisions, and just paying attention. But I don't know, I never felt it was the worst thing in the world. It's not like managing your agency, the spy agency. That I think is really quite tedious. I'm not a fan. The final three are adding mechanics to limit the size of your standing army, particularly post-war, is apparently still planned, though not a major priority on its own, as they will have some words on this later. They don't feel like it's something that's been glaringly missing for a game with a narrative of the crescendo to war, so it's more so an experiment around the fringes. I have to say though, I don't agree. I think this is perhaps a larger issue than maybe they take note of. The fact of the matter is, every nation in the game seems determined to build the largest army possible, and that has consequences on things like lag, and the way that you're planning to invade even the smallest nations. Post Gotterdammerung, it feels like there is some desire to play the game past 1945, even if the game is supposed to end around that time, because all the projects lead up to that period. Maybe you want to clean up your borders, settle some final scores, whatever it is. But that's not as fun if by the time you get to that point, every nation in the game is trying to stack more than 30 divisions. Have doctrines more strongly affect division designing? They say they've had some success here, with changes to support companies and equipment streamlining. They wouldn't go so far as to say they're done though, and have short medium-term plans regarding doctrines. I suppose I have to agree in this regard that the doctrines don't necessarily affect the way you design your divisions so much as they change the buffs that you're getting towards them. I know of course in Mass Assault there is the option to reduce infantry combat width, which means you can actually stick in more infantry divisions, but across the board the way that certain divisions are designed and the way they relate to combat, width and terrain isn't necessarily as strongly changed. Immersion and roleplay elements. Optional tools for making your mark in a game. They've added a lot of touch on this division, with division medals, plan naming, deeper recruitment designs, MIOs and industrial specialization being chief among them, feature-wise. While I can't disagree with them here, I do also think that there comes a certain tedium towards them as well, because it's difficult sometimes to delegate the prioritization between giving out medals to a single division, which maybe isn't as strong in certain contexts, versus managing your MIOs, which can be very impactful due to the time frame that the MIO's bonuses are applied. So it's difficult to say. If I was to think of anything on the spot in terms of immersion to the gameplay and fixing something that's very frustrating, I would put some note on the idea of the representation of your population in the form of stability. There are very weak elements to the concept of your national population being involved in the war, how they're interacting with it, how do they feel about it. To my memory, it really comes down to having more than 50% stability and getting that awful event where you lose tons of political power if you're below 50%, and sometimes you can spend like 125 and fail an 80% roll. That is like the worst event. It is so terrible, and there's nothing you can do about it. Instead, I would 10 times over prefer having like just a little bit of manpower in certain states to guarantee those kind of things never happen, or whatever it would be, to ensure that the civilian population is kept in line beyond random 80% failing event spam. If anything, I feel the Soviets did a pretty good job because they had the propaganda campaigns that we saw in No Step Back. Maybe if a feature like that was added where you spend 50 political power on a campaign poster that boosts stability for a period, then it's like, oh, okay, at least it makes sense within the context of what can be done. But now I'm just rambling to myself. As the retrospective comes to an end, one of the final things they talk about is their war effort updates. Not too much to comment on from my perspective, but it's a reminder of this edition from 2022, which saw things including persistent equipment designs, system rebalances, MIO streamlining, over 1,000 bug fixes, mod support, and more. I'm pretty sure these also came with additional formable nations and updates to the way some formable nations are made, so I was also happy with some of these war efforts. You could see in some light that this is something similar to the Stellaris team, having the post-content update team that kind of works on improving things in the background. However, this is also handled by the main team, so it's a middle ground, which has seen some positives, so no complaints from me. But what next? That section was longer than both they and I had expected, but the future plans are going to be more concise. Next up, we're going to be looking at the roadmap for the next few years, so I guess if the previous one is in 22, this was 25, so this is the content going all the way till 28. The following plans, they say, are not super specific, they're not promises, and they might not work out, but planning is something they intend to do. With it, we get the main reveal, that Southeast Asia is next, as the primary content focus is going to be on Japan and China, so I guess that's soft confirmation for Japan and China DLC coming next, and mechanics to support this narrative, as well as reinvigorating the Pacific War. Maybe island hopping mechanics will be improved. They don't want to get into too many specifics here, so maybe the next Dev Diary will be DLC reveal, but the war in and around Asia as well as the Pacific has been left behind by their recent developments directed at the European elements of conflict. Some things they're looking into are developing the narrative that faction membership will give you, improving and streamlining elements of naval control with a particular focus on naval warfare that carried the Pacific conflict, and adding greater strategic narrative, as well as a less opaque simulation to naval conflict. That is interesting. So, streamlining the naval system could be the difference between everybody having a much better understanding of the way the naval system works, but I'm interested in the idea of a narrative of faction membership. Of course, traditionally, in the Allies especially, it's always Britain that starts out spearheading, but with the arrival of America, that conflict of power kind of rises quite quickly, and it suddenly feels like the Americans are the ones spearheading, especially around the time that Germany has been defeated and they're continuing the war against Japan. So I wonder, instead of the 300 political power, very difficult decision to take over faction button, you're maybe going to see something akin to a balance of power struggle mechanic where different players are kind of vying for supremacy within a faction, and that person who's at the top is the one controlling everything. In terms of other things to look forward to, here's what long-term goals are included. Military doctrines and division designing. These systems to them feel quite old and don't offer much ability to shape your gameplay, so they want to link these better in order to have doctrines shape how you compose your divisions. I guess picking between mass assaults, grand battle plan, and superior firepower will seriously change your infantry. I mean, to my mind, all of the doctrines seem to be quite linear, so I wonder if they're going to be going with more of a pick your own path direction with it, kind of like a focus tree, where there are different branches you have to pick between to choose how they look. Manufacturing and industrial economic gameplay. Watch this space. Manufacturing. That's interesting. To anybody who's played Road to 56, you might be familiar that in that mod they have things like steelworks, where you can build a factory to produce steel. So you don't necessarily need to have a steel deposit, you can make your own, which I think is interesting. I wonder if there's going to be that kind of manufacturing to produce the resources that you then use to produce the military equipment. Breaking the snowball. HOI's crescendo to war that they mentioned earlier is extremely important to the main narrative of the war. However, as time has gone on and they've released more content focusing on smaller players, such as South America specifically, there are elements of the game that don't mesh well, and they want to take a look at the way wars and war escalation are structured to make this more engaging and less disruptive. Hard to say what they're planning on this front. The only thing I can think of is maybe changing the way world tension works. Maybe it's going to be something as like regional tension. Maybe hypothetically, you could start the game with regional tension. So tension in your Europe, Asia, South America, North America. And then once the conflict has gone global, through whatever means it might have done, it switches to world tension. So just because maybe somebody in America is justifying on everybody in South America, it doesn't necessarily mean that things have completely broken down in Asia, for example. It's always funny, of course, when one character, maybe in South America, as I say, raises world tension and they suddenly have started World War II because the Allies have guaranteed that nation and everything just collapses in on itself. Very strange. So maybe that's the kind of snowball they're talking about. But maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. Improving the diplomatic landscape. But you said you couldn't do this, I hear you cry. And mostly you would be right. However, with the introduction of late-game techs in Gotterdammerung, there is even more reason to continue playing after the end of the war, which is what I was saying earlier, so it's good to hear that being parroted here. They want to keep developing how the world falls out after the conflict, producing more realistic geopolitical results, as well as the potential for new and more system-driven what-if conflicts after the end of the war. Of course, any such changes would be multiplied in effect if they could also touch upon the pre-war landscape too. Very difficult to imagine what they could be planning here. To my mind, there are only, 3 things I'm really thinking of, which is 1, changing the way that factions work from being military alliances into kind of hegemonic spheres of influence between such as the West and the Soviet bloc, for example, and maybe you can create your own as things shift. Additionally, I'm thinking of the reduction of military presence, both because it helps with lag, but also the people's desire to be in a global conflict after one has just ended probably is on the collapse, kind of what I was talking about earlier with the roleplay, immersion, reflection of the civilian population. They basically only exist as stability and occasionally draining you of political power, but I'm also interested to hear what the general mood of the nation would be in certain situations. Lastly, and maybe this is just me, maybe nobody else on the planet would ever want to see this, and that's fine, but when they added those rockets in Gotterdammerung, my goodness, having an early space race, a very early space race would be so interesting to me. I can dream, right? I can dream that Poland can enter space in HOI4, but they will actually go to space. Polska Guru. The final thing they're talking about for the future of HOI4 is alt history, which is a broad category and one that has seen increasingly stark divide within different groups of the community on how they should, or even if they should in the first place, approach alt history. For those that enjoy it, they're not going to stop making alt history content. However, they are looking at ways in the long term of making more structured, plausible alternative history content with clearer historically adjacent narrative hooks. In addition, they're evaluating if it's possible to create more deterministic global alt history situations and produce some semi-alt history ways of playing HOI4, which would capture the fun parts of non-historical content while retaining the benefits of determinism. I have to agree that this is probably the better aspect than what happened with Graveyard of Empires, where the options were kind of caught between doing nothing in historical versus having the most crazed, grandiose alternative history paths, like restoring the East India Trading Company and owning the entire world. The final note on this is the practical elements of their desire to continue releasing what was previously termed country packs and unit packs. They're devoting some more resources to country pack development moving forward, I suppose to avoid the backlash that they got from Graveyard of Empires, and including mechanics and systemic changes in the way they make such expansions, albeit still focusing on minor players in the war. In terms of unit packs, I wonder if that's to do with the most recently released unit pack that introduced a variety of unit models which felt very much like they could have been part of special projects, but ultimately were not and were purely cosmetic. I think to some people, while it was clearly stated that they weren't special projects, they looked very much so like they could have been, and that alone I think spearheaded some confusion. While the dev diary does continue, talking about their 9th anniversary, some events coming up, and the Community Cup 2025 hosted by Dankus Mimkus, I think I'm going to end this video here, because I just wanted to talk about the retrospective and the future. So, what do you think? Do you like the direction HOI4's going in? Do you think they're focusing on the main things? And are you excited for Japan and China, basically not confirmed, to be the next major DLC? Personally, I think I'm most excited to see what they've got planned in terms of the industrial, economic, and hopefully trade perspective, so that building up the nation feels like a much more engaging experience. Not everything has to be about just civs, 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 so that could be interesting to see. I want to make some trade deals. And of course, my heart does slightly yearn for a late game space race. But that's it from me. If you liked this dev diary, then please feel free to like, feel free to subscribe. I will be continuing dev diaries as they come out because of course I will. And I suppose I'll see you all next time. Bye. Bye.